We now cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight. Entering the 12th day of its invasion, Russian forces continued heavy shelling in Ukraine, with Kiev officials saying that civilians are being targeted, including in hospitals, schools and residential areas. A third round of talks on Monday between their foreign ministers ended without anything tangible or conclusive, and there's growing concern that the war may stretch on for months and even years to come. We discussed the latest developments today with Bruce Jones, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's lovely to see you again, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again.
And well, there have been a lot of concerns mounting because, well, after French President Emmanuel Macron talked to Vladimir Putin on the phone on Sunday, he said that Putin was very much determined to see out his so-called, see through his so-called denazification of Ukraine. And Macron said that Putin seems pretty resolute on going all the way. For how long do you think the Russian president will be willing to continue with this war?
I think he'll be willing to continue for as long as it takes to achieve what he desires, which is essentially to erase Ukrainian sovereignty, or at the very least to create a political situation inside Ukraine vastly more favorable to Russia, essentially subservient to Russia. I think his odds of succeeding in that are now extremely low, but he can continue to inflict severe costs on Ukraine civilians for a long time to come. I think he'll be willing to continue until he's stopped, and he could be stopped by two things: the scale and sophistication and frankly, just heroism of the Ukrainian resistance, and what appears to be very significant problems of morale within his own armed forces, within the invading force. There appears to be huge confusion, huge morale problems. We don't have full insight into that, obviously. But his operation is not going anywhere like the way it should, and eventually could reach a point where it's not feasible to continue. But that could take months before we reach a point like that.
Well, for now, Ukrainians are left to fend for themselves, really, with equipment from the West, of course. And it seems that they're trying to make the war unwinnable for the Russians. And your Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, he said that over time, Ukraine could absolutely win the war. Would you agree with that? Do you think they can continue to put up this strong resistance?
I do. If you look at the situation, Russia is a country of some 140, 150 million people. Ukraine has 43 million people. It's a very large country. This is not, a major power invading some minor country someplace on the other side of the world. This is Ukraine has a substantial capacity to push back on Russian aggression, despite the gap in equipment. We've seen huge problems for Russia in its logistics, where they clearly fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Ukrainian resistance. Frankly, I think that Ukraine has already defeated Russia from achieving its core objective, which was a sort of a blitzkrieg style operation to take Kiev and install a new government. I think that's now out of reach. We've seen reversals for Russia in several theaters. Obviously, Russia has overwhelming advantages in terms of firepower and continues to shell Kharkiv and Kiev and other cities, inflicting substantial damage and substantial casualties, including to civilians. But their ability to achieve their objectives, I think, is almost out of reach at this stage, unless they retreat to more narrow objectives, like defending Donetsk and Luhansk as quote-unquote independent entities. That is still an achievable objective. Linking Donetsk to Crimea is still an achievable objective. Taking over the whole of Ukraine, I think, is now essentially out of reach for Russia.
And well, Vladimir Putin does seem pretty annoyed by these sanctions from the West. He said that they're akin to a declaration of war. Do you think this indicates that the sanctions are working? And also, what other measures is the US preparing to take?
The sanctions are much more far-reaching than he had any reason to expect. They're much more far-reaching than most people expected. I think he believed that he could weather the sanctions because he has major reserves, but the sanctions to the central bank are really going to make that much, much more difficult for him. We're going to see this starting to hit. We've already seen the ruble falling very substantially. We'll see it fall farther. We'll see the stock market fall dramatically. We'll see all sorts of kinds of shortages and constraints inside Russia. Unfortunately, those are going to hit the Russian population as well as the oligarchs. I think we'll see more sanctions on the oligarchs. We may see more sanctions on financial institutions. The big thing that the United States and others are holding back is sanctions on oil. That's both because the effect will be limited in the short term. If they sanction the oil sector, we'll simply see a big spike in the price of oil. That's problematic for the rest of the world, but it'll also mean in the short term increased revenues for the Russians. Over time, it's problematic, but in the short term, it's not. So I think they'll hold back on oil sanctions for now, although you are seeing a number of countries driven by their populations move to divorce themselves from Russian oil, but that will take years. That's not something that can be done overnight. So that one, so far, people are holding back on, and we'll see the sanctions really start to bite in the coming days, weeks, and then months. And the real question in my mind is, how long is the Russian system able to tolerate that level of pressure? Of course, they've been able to tolerate pressure before. And the oligarchs around Putin don't have a lot of leverage over him. So this could go on, unfortunately, for a very long period of time.
Well, Putin has said that he will adapt to the sanctions, but the impact of it does seem pretty inevitable in the long run. And well, do you think that Russia can then turn to their neighbors in Beijing?
Only to a modest degree. China at this stage is not going to risk getting cut off from European and American financial institutions by violating the sanctions. We've already seen that major Chinese institutions are restricting their lending. That's to avoid the consequences for themselves. They'll do some modest things. There'll be some leakage in the sanctions. We already saw China increasing its wheat purchasing program from Russia. That will help Russia a little bit. If there are restrictions on oil, China will buy as much Russian oil as it can get its hands on. But there's a limit to the extent to which China can bail Russia out here. They can buffer it at the edges. They can't really dull the full impact of the sanctions.
Well, a New York Times report recently cited that a Western intelligence report said Beijing seemed to have been somewhat aware of Russia's plans for invasion, and the attack was actually delayed until after the Beijing Olympics was held. Do you think, if true, this indicates that China is comfortable with these developments, and whether do you think they're in support of Russia's actions?
There is zero chance that Putin traveled to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping, signed a 5,000-word declaration on this unlimited friendship between the two countries, and didn't mention to him that he was about to invade Ukraine. There's zero chance that that's true. It's self-evidently the case that China knew about the invasion, the U.S. intelligence about asking for the delay until the Olympics. It seems logical, but I can't verify that. But there's no question that Xi Jinping knew about this. My guess is that he assumed that it would go much better than it's gone, and that he wouldn't look so out of step with the rest of the international community, because both of their assumptions would be that Russia would have performed much better, been able to have secured the results much more quickly, that the West would have been more divided. So it's quite possible that Xi miscalculated. It's possible that he feels a little bit misled by Putin. We don't know that. My assumption is that they're not particularly comfortable, given how badly this is going, given the weaknesses in the Russian setup that this has exposed. On the other hand, I think it's clear that China, for some time now, has made the determination that it will look to displace the West from the commanding heights of international order, that it will seek to challenge American hegemony over the order, especially the security order over time, other dimensions as well, economic, technological, etc. I do not mean that that necessarily involves the same kind of tactics that Putin has used in Ukraine. But for a long time, China has been quite happy to have Russia out there taking greater risks, being very aggressive, being assertive, causing trouble for the West. China gets to sit back and play the kind of larger game. But in this case, I think it's absolutely clear that China has gave Putin a diplomatic green light for what happened here.
Well, will this crisis affect China's calculations and its competition with the US and also its ambitions in the South China Sea, do you think?
My strong guess is that the Chinese aren't going to make that judgment for several months to come. There's no reason for them to reach hasty conclusions. We're still only 12 days in. This could look very different. But at the very least, they have to be noticing the degree of unity, not only in Europe, but the extent to which America's Asian friends and partners and allies like South Korea, like Japan, like Singapore, etc., rallied to support the sanctions and the technology export restrictions against Russia. They have to notice that. I hope that they are paying attention to how much it is the case that a determined population can resist an invasion. My own view is that a sort of full-blown military invasion of Taiwan from Beijing is not Xi Jinping's first choice or second choice or third choice. I'm sure he hasn't ruled it out, but it's certainly not their primary, their preferred strategy for dealing with Taiwan. I think they'll have many other approaches before they go for a full invasion. So the lessons are not that direct. And there's a fundamental difference. In Ukraine, we had essentially sort of loud rhetoric from the West, but there was no actual, Western troop presence in Ukraine other than a few trainers, etc. But in the case of Taiwan, the rhetoric is a lot softer. But there's the Seventh Fleet between the Chinese mainland and Formosa Island, and that's a very big barrier, a very big military barrier to whatever Xi's ambitions might be.
And well, in the meantime, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, he warned that if the West does not increase military aid, then Moscow would advance on the rest of Europe. Do you think the world should be prepared for such a scenario where Putin attacks a NATO country?
I mean, we obviously have to be prepared for it. I think it is fundamentally different to attack NATO versus a non-NATO actor. Those are very different things. I have no doubt that Putin went into Ukraine believing that this would go much, much better, and that at the end of it, he would have consolidated his position in Ukraine, as well as Belarus, by the way, and be in a stronger position to threaten and to challenge NATO. And if we had seen weakness and hesitation and division in NATO, then his calculation might be to kind of go for it and to actually make a break into the Baltics or something similar to try to really sow dissent and break Article 5 of NATO. But of course, we've seen this horrible military performance from his forces inside Ukraine, and we've seen substantial unity in NATO, a major change in German foreign policy. We're seeing changes in the foreign policy of all the major Baltic states, or sort of Nordic states, excuse me. And so I think his options are now much weaker than they were. I think his ability to challenge NATO and his borders now is much weaker than it was at the beginning of this, ironically, given his stated goals.
And of course, no one can really confirm or be sure of what's running through the Russian president's mind. But do you think it really is the revival of the Soviet Union or revenge on America and the West?
You know, when a guy like Putin tells you that he intends to restore the Russian Imperium, and he tells you again and again and again, at a certain point you should listen. And he's been telling us for years and years and years that he believes that that Russia should restore Russian Imperium, not just Soviet Imperium, but Russian Imperium. So surely that is in his mind. Surely that is his ambition. Whether it's his actual plan is a very different thing. I've worked with a lot of people like Putin, a lot of leaders like Putin. In my experience, what they do is they do not decide what their tactics are in advance. They are constantly reevaluating their choices. They're constantly reevaluating the situation. They devote every waking minute of their day to increasing their ability to have flexibility, both domestically and internationally. So I would have high confidence in saying that he went into Ukraine not knowing where it would end, not knowing what his next step would be, confident in his ability to roll with the punches, so to speak. And I think has been badly surprised by the scale of Ukrainian opposition and by the scale of Western response. But that by no means is Russia out of options. By no means are they out of tools to pressure the West, cyber, energy, and other, let alone the use of sort of the rhetoric of nuclear escalation as a form of blackmail and threat.
Well, that was Bruce Jones, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on.